It was just past 9 o'clock and full dark when the missile struck. It hit squarely on the port side of the American warship Stark, a relatively new Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate. The 1,700-pound missile had skimmed the surface of the sea at 700 miles an hour before smashing into the Stark's side and tearing a 10 by 15-foot hole in her hull. It passed through the crew's quarters, the ship's barber shop, and the post office, and lodged against the ship's starboard side. The damage was extensive, though it would have been far worse if the warhead had exploded. Then the second missile hit, and it did explode. The detonation caused massive damage and ignited fires throughout the ship. With 2 giant holes in her side, the Stark listed dangerously to port, and her captain, Commander Glenn Brindell, ordered counterflooding to keep her from rolling over altogether. The explosion ignited a number of fires, which the damage control teams fought throughout the night. The fires were so hot they melted the aluminum alloy of the ship's superstructure. Water sprayed into the fire turned into superheated steam that scalded the firefighters. Some fell unconscious after breathing the heavy smoke. Still, the crew kept at it, fighting the blaze all night and into the next day. Not until late the next afternoon, after 19 hours, was it evident that the ship would survive. The Stark limped back into port at Bahrain with 37 dead and 21 wounded on board. This incident in the Persian Gulf on May 17, 1987, is a particularly dramatic example of the perilous environment in which the United States Navy operated in the late 20th century. It was an environment characterized by hazy and confusing political relationships and highly destructive ordnance. Having emerged from World War II virtually unchallenged as the greatest naval power on Earth, the U.S. Navy enjoyed several decades of naval supremacy, fighting wars in both Korea and Vietnam, and maintaining an effective deterrent against the Soviet Union. Yet even then, national rivalries between other countries in Asia, in Africa, in South America, and in this case, in the Middle East, put the United States Navy in the precarious and frustrating position of being caught in the middle of a deadly war in which it was not a protagonist. It was a set of circumstances characterized by, even defined by, 3 striking and remarkable aspects of naval warfare in the late 20th century, all 3 of which were evident in the attack on the Stark. The first is the ambiguous political environment. In 1980, the year Ronald Reagan was elected president, the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein ordered his army to invade Iran. His goal was to expand Iraq's tiny coastline at the head of the Persian Gulf. He fully expected that Reagan and the United States would sympathize with his objective, maybe even actively support him, because Americans remained furious about the Iranian hostage crisis the year before. In November of 1979, Iranian fundamentalists had stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and taken more than 50 Americans hostage, holding them for 444 days before finally releasing them. Yet, despite seething anger about that, the U.S. remained neutral in the war between Iraq and Iran, even as the war continued year after year with horrifying casualties. By 1987, with more than 1 million dead, the Iran-Iraq War had become the 3rd bloodiest international war of the 20th century, surpassed only by the 2 world wars. That is not to say that the United States was unconcerned. Iraq and Iran fought each other not only along a common border, but also in the Persian Gulf, through which 20% of the world's oil supply passed. Both countries attacked that traffic, the Iraqis by air, the Iranians by sea. In July of 1987, the United States began escorting neutral tankers through the war zone to protect the global flow of oil. So the U.S. Navy found itself in a war, even though it was not at war. It demonstrated that even though the United States was the world's only superpower, it could not always dictate or control events. It also made it awkward for U.S. Navy ship captains to know how to react to potential threats. Their orders told them not to take sides, but they were charged with protecting American interests in the region, and that included ensuring the safe passage of neutral oil tankers through the war zone. Doing both of those things at the same time was problematic, if not actually contradictory. In addition to this political ambiguity, the second thing the attack on the Stark demonstrated was the technological sophistication of modern naval weapons. The missiles that struck the Stark were French-made Exocet AM-39 air-to-surface missiles that skimmed the sea only a few feet above wave height, making them all but invisible to radar. They flew at 700 miles an hour, just below the speed of sound, so they did not create a detectable sonic boom. Still, it was fast enough that they arrived within seconds of being launched. The Stark, too, had technologically sophisticated weapons. In addition to her array of guns, she could fire either an SM-1 Standard missile or the ship-killing Harpoon missile. And to defend against missile attacks, she had what was called the Phalanx Close-In Weapons System. The Navy acronym was CIWS, though virtually everyone called it a CIWS. It resembled a white beehive, and it sat near the stern above the helicopter deck. Despite its benign appearance, the CIWS had an integrated radar and computer system that automatically aimed and triggered a bundle of gun barrels capable of firing 3,000 rounds of depleted uranium bullets per minute. That's 50 rounds per second. Let me say that again. It fired 50 rounds per second. In effect, it threw up a wall of ordnance so impenetrable that virtually nothing could pass through it unscathed, even at close range. But here's the third thing that the attack on the Stark revealed. In addition to the new ambiguity and impressive technology, the time available for ship commanders to make a decision had been dramatically compressed. During World War II, radar gave ship captains early warning of an incoming enemy air attack. They might have 20 minutes or more advance notice. Now they might have 20 seconds or less. In addition, the rules of engagement under which U.S. Navy ships operated in the Persian Gulf were complex. Their orders were to defend themselves if confronted by forces that demonstrated hostile intent or any ship taking hostile action. But intent is difficult, if not literally impossible, to determine. How can I know what anyone else might be thinking? And hostile action, once initiated, left only seconds to react. In the case of the Stark, Captain Brindle knew there was an Iraqi jet in the vicinity. He knew that because a U.S. Navy E-3 patrol plane called an AWACS, equipped with a giant saucer-like radar on top of its fuselage, was flying overhead. Its crew identified the Iraqi jet the moment it took off from Shaibah airfield in southern Iraq and tracked it as it flew south down the middle of the Gulf. But an Iraqi plane flying down the Gulf was not unusual. It happened all the time. Usually they turned east, flew into Iranian airspace, fired a missile or two, and then sped home. Since the U.S. was not a belligerent in the Iran-Iraq war, this was simply none of our business. This time, though, the Iraqi jet turned sharply toward the Stark. Brindle sent out a radio warning. Unknown aircraft. This is U.S. Navy warship on your 078 for 12 miles. Request you identify yourself. Instead of answering, the Iraqi pilot fired 2 Exocet missiles. Brindle ordered the Stark to turn hard to starboard to unmask the Sea Whiz system on the stern. Too late. Afterward, Brindle and the officer in the Combat Information Center of the Stark both lost their jobs. A Navy investigation concluded that Brindle had failed to provide combat-oriented leadership. However fair or unfair that might have been, the rules of engagement under which Brindle operated made it difficult for him to be proactive in the ship's defense. He could not shoot down every plane that came within the envelope of his guns or his missiles. The hostile intent of the Iraqi pilot became evident only after the Exocet missiles were on their way. So in these 3 ways, ambiguity, technology, and the vastly accelerated pace of decision-making, the attack on the Stark in April 1987 exposed the difficult and complicated environment in which the U.S. Navy operated in the 1980s, especially, though not exclusively, in the Middle East. For more than 2 centuries of American history, whenever wars broke out anywhere in the world, the United States had generally relied on either its vast distance from the fighting in order to stay out of it altogether, or if it did become involved, it sought the complete destruction of its enemy, absolute victory, in Franklin Roosevelt's memorable words. But the world of the late 20th century was a different ballgame. American entanglement in the Middle East had its roots in the years immediately after World War II. If we look for a specific moment when that entanglement began, we might choose February 14th, Valentine's Day, in 1945. On that date, Franklin Roosevelt was returning from the Yalta Conference with Churchill and Stalin when he stopped in Egypt to meet with King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia on board the American cruiser USS Quincy. The 2 items on their agenda were oil and Palestine. FDR knew that the vast oil reserves beneath the sands of the Saudi Arabian desert would become increasingly important in the post-war years. Prior to World War II, the United States had been the world's most prolific producer and exporter of oil, which had given the U.S. an enormous advantage over the Axis powers during the war. But American oil reserves were not infinite, and FDR wanted to ensure continued access to the oil of the Middle East. The other issue was Palestine, a British mandate along the eastern end of the Mediterranean, an area that was sacred to several religions. In 1917, Arthur Balfour, then the British Foreign Secretary, had issued a document, ever since known as the Balfour Declaration, that Palestine would be set aside to become a Jewish state. And in 1922, Jews from throughout Europe began to migrate there. The goal of a Jewish state gained urgency during World War II as the horrors of the Holocaust became known. King Saud, like most Arabs, opposed the creation of a Jewish state in the middle of the mostly Muslim Middle East, and he knew that his possession of vast oil reserves gave him leverage in that discussion. In 1948, a United Nations resolution officially created the State of Israel. An American post-war industrial expansion in the 1950s began to strain U.S. oil reserves. In response to these twin pressures, and as part of America's continuing rivalry with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, the United States Navy created the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean in 1950. Officially, its mission was to advance security and stability in Europe and Africa, though that was sufficiently vague as to leave a lot of uncertainty about precisely how it would function. That uncertainty was evident during what was called the Six-Day War in 1967 between Israel and Egypt. The war was triggered when Egypt, despite international agreements, closed the Strait of Tiran at the southern end of the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli traffic. Israel thereupon launched a full-scale assault on Egyptian air and ground forces in the Sinai Desert. Swiftly overcoming the Egyptians, Israeli forces drove toward the Suez Canal. Though the Israelis were the aggressors, most Americans sympathized with the Israelis who, despite their military proficiency, were seen as victims and underdogs. The United States declared itself officially neutral, and the ships of the American Sixth Fleet stayed away from the scene of combat. But one American ship remained in the vicinity, a former World War II victory ship named the USS Liberty, that had been converted by the National Security Agency into an intelligence-gathering vessel. It had all sorts of electronic antenna, but carried only 4 machine guns. On June 8, 1967, with the war in the Sinai at full flood, Israeli jets attacked the Liberty in broad daylight. The initial attack killed 8 American sailors and wounded 75. The Liberty's captain, William McGonigal, himself wounded, sent out a distress call to the Sixth Fleet. Under attack by unidentified jet aircraft, require immediate assistance. Instead of help, 2 more Israeli jets arrived. They were armed with napalm bombs, and they set the Liberty afire from stem to stern. After the planes withdrew, a trio of Israeli torpedo boats approached the Liberty. The Israeli boats launched torpedoes, and one of them hit the Liberty on her starboard side, opening a hole in her hull and killing 25 more American sailors. The torpedo boats then strafed the Liberty with machine gun fire. By the time the torpedo boats withdrew, 30 Americans were dead and 171 wounded. Afterward, the Israelis declared that it had all been a tragic mistake, a case of misidentification. That was dubious at best, since the attack had taken place in broad daylight and at close range. Israel apologized and eventually awarded some $14 million to the families of the killed and wounded. President Lyndon Johnson accepted the Israeli explanation and apology, though both at the time and since, many have suspected that the Israelis had acted to prevent the Americans from gathering information about Israeli troop movements in the Sinai. Unless and until secret Israeli archives become public, we will never know. But note how closely the Liberty incident in 1967 presaged many aspects of the attack on the Stark 20 years later, including the difficulty of determining who was the enemy, the possibility of being victimized by friendly fire, and the speed of decision-making. Just as President Johnson accepted the Israeli explanation for mistaken identity for the attack on the Liberty, President Reagan accepted the Iraqi explanation of pilot error for the attack on the Stark. The United States was less forgiving, however, when Iran was the culprit. On April 14, 1988, a sister ship of the Stark, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, was cruising at slow speed in the Persian Gulf when a topside lookout spotted floating mines. The skipper of the Roberts, Paul Rinn, ordered all stop and tried to back slowly out of the minefield. But as he did, a gigantic explosion all but lifted the ship out of the water. It ripped a 25-foot hole in her bottom and ignited fires that spread quickly because of damaged fuel tanks. The crew performed heroic damage control, and the ship managed to remain afloat. Subsequent investigation revealed that the mine had been laid by what was called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. This was not a formal or official part of the Iranian Defense Force. Indeed, when the Iranian government learned that the Revolutionary Guard had sowed mines in a shipping channel, its navy tried to sweep them up. Still, because Iranians had placed the mines, the United States decided it must retaliate to deter further such transgressions. But where and how? The U.S. was not at war, so attacking Iran itself would be hugely disproportionate and of questionable legality. Navy leaders suggested finding and sinking an Iranian warship, tit for tat. In particular, they wanted to sink the Iranian frigate Sabalan, which had been harassing neutral shipping in the Gulf. The Sabalan, however, was moored in the harbor at Bandar Abbas near the Strait of Hormuz. Attacking her there would produce too much collateral damage. In the end, the Reagan administration decided to destroy several Iranian-owned gas and oil separation plants in the Gulf known as GOSPs. And if the Sabalan or any other Iranian warship came out of port to interfere with that, the U.S. Navy could sink her. U.S. warships executed the attack on the GOSP platforms on April 18, 1988, 4 days after the Roberts incident. Iranian military forces on the platforms tried to fight back, but after being subjected to a storm of 5-inch shells, they surrendered, and the U.S. allowed them to evacuate. Then the American warships opened fire on the platforms, intending to destroy them. That proved more difficult than anticipated. After firing 1,000 rounds, the platform still stood. The Navy then used helicopters to insert Marine combat teams on the platforms. The Marines rappelled down onto the platform, planted demolition charges. After they withdrew, the charges were detonated and the platforms disappeared. As an aside, when President Reagan read over the subsequent reports of the attack, he called in his naval aide to ask him why a ship had needed to fire 1,000 rounds at an oil platform. In what he intended as a jest, the aide told him that it was a Navy tradition to let each sailor on board fire 1 round. Instead of laughing at the joke, Reagan replied simply, "Okay." So, mission accomplished. Or maybe not. When Iranian forces learned that their oil platforms were being attacked, they decided to sortie with their navy. It was a disastrous decision. The Iranian Navy had several modern and effective warships, but they would be hopelessly outnumbered by U.S. Navy forces in the Gulf. Nevertheless, on April 18, 1988, the Iranian and U.S. navies engaged in the largest surface naval battle since World War II. Captain James Chandler, who was skipper of the U.S. cruiser Wainwright and commander of a 3-ship flotilla dubbed Action Group Charlie, ordered his ships to prepare for combat. He sent a helicopter toward the approaching Iranian vessel to make a positive visual identification. It was the Joshan, a relatively small Iranian warship, but it was armed with the American-made Harpoon missile, which Chandler and everyone else knew was an effective ship killer. Chandler, in both English and Farsi, radioed Iranian patrol frigate. "This is United States Navy warship. Do not interfere with my actions. Remain clear or you will be destroyed." He got no response. So he tried again. "Heed my warning. Stop your engines. If you do not stop, I will take you under fire." Nothing. He tried one more time. "Stop and abandon ship. I intend to sink you." At that moment, the Joshan fired its Harpoon missile. In the Wainwright's Combat Information Center, technicians detected the launch, calling out, "I have separation." Almost simultaneously, they detected the electronic signature of the homing device on the Harpoon. Chandler then did two things at once. He launched what is called chaff, aluminized plastic confetti that was designed to confuse the homing mechanism on approaching missiles. And he ordered all three of his ships to open fire, reporting, "Birds free." The Iranian missile, confused by the chaff, passed within mere feet of the Wainwright, so close sailors on board could feel the heat of the propellant, and it crashed into the water. All of the American missiles struck the Joshan, setting it afire from stem to stern. It was dead in the water, but it remained afloat. Chandler reported the circumstances to his boss, Rear Admiral Anthony Less, who commanded the Joint Task Force in the Middle East. Less put him on hold and contacted Admiral William Crowe, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Here's another revealing aspect of naval warfare in the late 20th century. Communications were such that officers engaged in active combat in the Persian Gulf could check with officials in Washington in almost real time. Because one of the Navy's goals had been to sink an Iranian warship, Crowe told Less to order Chandler to finish off the Joshan. Chandler gave the job to the USS Simpson, a sister ship of both the Stark and the Roberts. The Simpson fired one more Standard missile in surface mode. After that, all three ships of Chandler's action group closed to within gun range of the Joshan and pounded her with half a dozen swift salvos. The Joshan disappeared. Yet the battle was not over. In addition to the Joshan, the Iranians also sortied with two other ships, the Sahand and the despised Sabalan. The Americans attacked both with missiles from another surface action group and by planes from the aircraft carrier Enterprise. The Sahand was sunk, and the Salaban heavily damaged, dead in the water and burning. Once again, Admiral Less checked with Washington for instructions. In the Navy Command Center in the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Frank Carlucci asked Admiral Crowe, "What should we do?" Crowe shook his head. "We've killed enough people," he said. He ordered the U.S. Navy ships to leave the Salaban where it was and retire. Later, Iranian tugs towed the crippled Salaban back into Bandar Abbas, and it eventually returned to service. The events of April 18, 1988, illuminated in a particularly dramatic way the difficult and deadly environment in which the U.S. Navy operated. Just 3 months later, in July, the cruiser USS Vincennes, which had replaced the Wainwright in the Gulf, was engaged with a number of small but nevertheless dangerous Iranian bog hammer gunboats, when its radar detected that a jet aircraft had taken off from Iran and was closing swiftly. After sending out several warnings, to which there was no reply, the Vincennes fired 2 Standard missiles in air mode. Those missiles struck Iran Air passenger jet number 655, which was on a scheduled flight to Dubai. All 290 civilian passengers on board were killed. It was both a horrible tragedy and another measure of the new and dangerous world in which the U.S. Navy now operated.